You're listening to the Restoration Podcast, conversations of hope and healing. Join us as we talk about subjects dealing with ministry, faith, everyday life, and other hot topics. Our prayer is that these conversations bring encouragement to your life.
We just go. How you doing, man?
I'm doing good.
Breakfast smoothie, all good?
It was all good. So we're here this morning to talk about our church planting pipeline.
We are here to talk about a church planting pipeline, specifically how we want to develop spiritual leaders and how we have something cool, but let's save it to the end to announce the cool thing and how they can be a part of it.
Yeah.
For now, I was dreaming of a question last night because I couldn't fall asleep. I was staring at my ceiling, wishing I could fall asleep and going, I know what I'm going to ask Pastor Johnny about spiritual leadership, okay? And I'll answer too to give you some time to think about it. But who are two spiritual leaders in your life, past or present, that made a profound impact on your life? One, maybe let's go one inside of church and inside of ministry, and maybe one outside of church and outside of ministry. Because I want to get the idea that we're not just here to make pastors and ministers, but we're actually here to grow human beings as spiritual leaders, to grow Christians, to kind of activate their faith to move forward. So I know, first off, my inside the church one was pretty easy. I've got a couple to choose from, but I could put you in that list and say,
thanks.
Yeah, well, come on, man. You're a person who saw that I had some kind of gifts, and you said, hey, would you want to step in and have a platform to use those gifts? And you've continued to walk alongside me, and even when you kicked me out and fired me so that I could go plant a church, that's how that happened, right? Do you have a laugh track to cue?
No, I think the way all that happened was, hey, Pastor Johnny, can I talk to you about something?
Yeah. Whenever I say, hey, can I talk to you about something, it's never going to be easy.
It won't be 5 minutes.
It won't be 5 minutes, and it'll be probably scary.
Desiree and I were driving back from Sioux Falls a couple weeks ago, and as we came through Elk Point, I just had the Lord ask me this question of, what if?
You know that you've told the story too many times when other people start telling you the story back to you. I guess I did kind of a whole tour telling people that story. So,
But I had to tell you, okay, well, first of all, you were an answer to prayer because that is one of our target cities. And so you were an answer to prayer, but I also knew that if I didn't let you do it, that kind of sounds bad. If I didn't support you in doing it, that you would go somewhere and do it because you had a call on your life that was beyond being a worship pastor.
Right.
So why fight it? Join it. Support you, empower you, and help me help you. You help us.
Well, I think it sounds great, but I do think there are a lot of spiritual leaders, people who are in positions of spiritual authority, who would have been a little bit more closed-handed. They might have been like, yeah, that's great. Give me 5 more years. Or, yeah, that's great, but, why don't you make sure that you take care of this and this and this and this and this for me before I go? There was none of the kind of the arm twisting. And in terms of spiritual leadership and mentorship, you've walked through the whole process with me. There was never the old school model of church planting was, give them a $50 check, pray for him, and then kick him out the door. That resource.
Even if they got $50.
Yeah, well, maybe. Thank you. That's what we need. But there was none of that. You continued to walk with Desiree and I, and continued to move forwards. And I think that's a spiritual leader, or a spiritual mentor. So
I think the biggest stipulation I gave you was I said, okay, I'll support you on this, but you've got to help me find your replacement, because you were certainly a very integral part in our staff, and then working with me on Sundays, because the worship pastor has to be in sync with the senior pastor. You got to be able to know what they like, kind of read their mind. You were very good at doing that, or reading my mind, of knowing, okay, I know where he's going to want to go with this.
Yeah, I remember lots of talks sitting in Bill's office. Bill started to give me the cheat codes, and okay, when he paces like this, when he does this, when he comes up, do that. He gave me some of the cheat codes, but I did kind of.
I never knew that.
We refined that language, yeah, because there were a couple of Sundays where I'd be leading, and I'd look up and realize, oh, Johnny's already been at his pulpit for 2 full choruses, and he's like, yeah, here's the cue, here's what you got to look for, and here's when in the song,
So what is the cue that you had to look for?
Well, there's
so I'd know.
There's you have a couple of ticks, and I don't want to spoil the magic, but you have a couple of ticks on the front row, where I know certain hand positions, certain ways you're moving, certain ways you might look, and I would
Okay.
go, oh, okay, he's coming up in 30 seconds. You know?
Okay.
And
I wonder if
give you
Aaron's
tips
picked
too.
up. Have
Yeah.
you picked up on those?
Well, Bill said to watch your hips.
Watch my hips.
hey,
I don't know if
Shakira,
that's
Shakira.
accurate or not, but
Hips don't lie, man.
that's what he told me. He said, watch his hips.
Oh my goodness.
Johnny's hips don't lie. No, but then there's also like little things like once you're already up behind the pulpit, little preferences. And I read into them. Sometimes you want the room to go down and even out. Sometimes you want the room to build and go.
Yeah.
And you're usually pretty good about telling the band where you want to go, but once you've been through it a few times, you're able to like read the lingo and all that stuff. But so in that sense, like it's even leadership, you know, subconsciously, non-verbally, like just being in that, you know, moment together. But yeah, you just get used to it.
Yeah.
It's
So,
a job.
there was a lot of things that were falling in place that we could not see. You know, we could not see where that was going to go. Number one, we didn't know. When I say we, you and I did not know until we went and met with the district superintendent of South Dakota, and you know, and I'd kept Steve Shibley in the loop of what we were wanting to do, and he certainly gave us his blessings. But when we went and met with him, we said we're really ready to flip this switch. He said, "Well, just want you to know that's been a target city for 20 years."
Right.
So little did we know that we're helping to fulfill a vision that they had had.
Right.
And then you're helping to fulfill a vision that we had to go plant a church there. And then little did we know in all that process, other things that would be falling in place, such as, you know, we looked for a number of worship leaders. Things just fell through.
Yeah.
For various reasons.
Eventually, we started scraping the bottom of the barrel to find. No.
And then one day I get this phone call from Aaron. It
Yeah.
says, "Could I apply for that job?" And it never ever crossed my mind about contacting, you know, my son-in-law about being the worship pastor, not because I didn't think he could do it. I just didn't think he had the desire. I thought he just wanted to be a music teacher.
Yeah.
You know, that was what he wanted to do.
Man,
And so,
it's a wild ride.
yeah,
I'm
it
glad.
took us over a year to get to that. And
I mean, we announced February of 2020, and then I think Aaron's first day was August 1st of 21.
Yeah.
Yeah, August 1st.
Was it 21 or 22?
August 1st,
21.
2021.
Okay.
Yeah. So it was from the time we announced to the time he showed up, it was a full year and a half.
Yeah.
Which, you know, not complaining. It was divinely inspired, but you led us through that process really well. So I would call you a spiritual leader on my church side. I would also call my dad like a spiritual
I sure
leader.
hope so.
And I know not everyone can say that their dad was a really steady spiritual leader in their life. But I think he taught me a lot of things. Like he taught me how to take the Bible really seriously and how to take church really seriously, and how even in those two things to not take yourself too seriously. And I think that it's something I've really subconsciously brought into just my ministerial life. That like I can be very intense about the things that need to be intense, but I don't have to take myself too seriously. Like I can crack a joke at my own expense, or, you know, that it can be fun to be at church sometimes. So I definitely appreciate my dad for that. You know, there are other things, like he made me a Yankees fan that are, I guess this year it's kind of paying off, but
Yeah, they're going to go to. They're in the
World Series
World
game 1
Series.
Friday.
Yeah.
Yeah, not to give away the time we're recording this for whenever it's posting it, but if this World Series is already over by the time we post it.
Yeah, that'd be funny if this post like
way
after.
Yeah, and
an
then they
embarrassing
got
defeat.
swept, and Shohei just had
Embarrassing
12 home
defeat.
runs. Okay.
Is it going to be them? And is it them and the Dodgers?
Yeah.
Old school.
Yeah. Yankees, Dodgers, man.
Old school lineup.
My dad hates.
Man, if they could have if somehow or another they could bring back a virtual Yogi Berra and a Tommy Lasorda.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, like those
Yes.
holograms of them.
Absolutely. Oh man, it would be and just have him like right sitting above the
And of
dugout.
course, you'd have to have one of George Steinbrenner.
Oh, Steiny. I'd love to see Joe Torre
Yeah.
just come back sitting there. It's not very interesting to have a hologram of a baseball manager. I mean, they get paid to sit there like this, just going.
And look grumpy.
And that's it. That's all you got.
Yeah, give me the lefty or the righty.
Yeah, exactly.
Out of the bullpen.
So, okay, so those are kind of two spiritual leaders in my life, spiritual mentors in my life who have poured into me. Who's a mentor or two of yours that stand out in
Yeah.
your story?
So I think the first one I'd have to go back to would be my home pastor, the guy that was really responsible for me coming to know the Lord, and not only for me coming to know the Lord, but the best way I can put it is he made sure I stayed saved.
Mm-hmm.
And what do I mean by that was he saw, okay, here's a young man that has gotten saved, but he has no spiritual infrastructure in his life.
Yeah, no spiritual
No,
support system.
right.
Yeah.
So he made sure that I stayed in church.
Mm-hmm.
And what do I mean by that? It means that so I got saved when I was 13. So from the time I was 13 until I turned 16 and got my own car and I could drive,
Mm-hmm.
either he drove 18 miles one way every Sunday to pick me up and take me to church, and then I would spend the Sunday afternoon with he and his family, and then after church on Sunday night, he would either take me back, or there were some people that lived down in my part of town that went to the church that would either pick me up on a Sunday if he couldn't, or they would take me back on a Sunday night. But just made sure that there was some spiritual presence in my life, some accountability person, somebody to keep me safe.
Yeah.
So I would say that would be the first spiritual person.
So I've never put this two and two together because you've told me about this guy before, but he is a pastor who preached on Sundays, who took like an extra hour or 45 minutes or so out of his Sunday morning to go drive and pick you up and bring you to church.
Yep.
A rowdy teenager,
Yep.
Full head of hair,
Full head of hair.
you just,
Flowing hair.
flowing Luke Skywalker locks.
So, I think what did church started at Sunday school is 9:30 and till 10:30, and then church started at 11.
Wow.
But still, he had to get up and, drive. I mean, you're right. It added an extra hour to his schedule, but I'm very thankful because if he hadn't have done that, then there's a really, really good possibility, large chance that I would have fallen through the cracks.
Sure. Yeah, because
Just got lost in the shuffle.
you have that camp experience because you got saved in a Georgia
Youth
church
camp.
Yeah, I've heard that story before. The open air and
Tabernacle.
not allowed to wear shorts, and it's 137 in the shade in Georgia, and you're just sweating at the altar. I can understand how there's probably a lot of kids who have that moment at camp where they're away from their normal life.
And that was back before, the only phone on the campground was a payphone.
Yeah, exactly.
There were no cell phones. I mean, when you went to camp back then, you really unplugged from the world for an entire week.
For sure. But
And it was amazing.
And I bet it's so. That's what I love about the South Dakota camp, by the way.
It's so far out there that there's no.
It's
cell
out in
phone
Deadwood.
Yeah.
There's literally no cell phone reception. You drive past this point, and it's 45 minutes outside of Rapid, and it's in the middle of nowhere. And they very intentionally have asked that they don't put cell phone towers in there. And so you go in, your cell phone's a brick. There's one phone. It's like a landline in the nurse's office.
Emergency only.
Yeah. And they'll let us, they let counselors use it once a day to call home just to make sure everything's okay. Yeah. But as far as kids go, it's there's nothing. There's no Snapchat, no nothing. But you have that incredible experience, and then you don't have the spiritual support system at home. You don't have an environment at home that's maybe conducive to staying on track with the Lord. And so this guy.
It's not that my parents didn't support me.
Sure.
It's just they were glad I was saved.
Yeah.
They didn't take me to church and go with me to church.
Yeah. So they weren't antagonistic.
No.
But they weren't exactly.
There was no Bible reading in my house. There was no prayer before a meal. There was no, hey, before you leave, let me pray for you, that kind of thing. There was none of that.
Interesting.
So I'd say my pastor was the first one. So that would be inside the ministry. Another person that became a real mentor to me spiritually is one of my really, really good friends. His name is Mike. I met him at my first church I worked at in Georgia, and so he really mentored me in the fact of he showed me how to be a good Christian father.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
And he had 3 boys, and I remember some of the things that I saw him do that had a really, really profound impact because Angie and I were married for 10 years before we had our first child, Tori, and that was after we moved to Texas. But I watched how my friend Mike, how he invested in his boys, how he would show up to church early on Sunday mornings. We had prayer time. He'd bring his boys with him, and his oldest one, Jeremy, would walk with him, and he'd be holding his dad's hand while they were praying, walking and praying. I just saw how he was just he's a businessman, but how he really, really loved his family. He loved the Lord, how he spiritually invested in his boys. So that really, really was he visually taught me. And
Yeah.
and we were super close friends, and we did a lot with their family. And so it wasn't just something that I saw him do on Sunday mornings where
Yeah.
the stage.
Yes. Yeah. It
I
was
saw
real.
I saw him do it at home.
And did he ever sit you down and say, these are the 5 habits or principles? You just,
Saw him. Yeah.
you saw him from afar. You probably had a relationship. You were probably relatively close, but
Yeah.
you just understood that, hey, there's some habits that he has that I want to,
Yeah.
integrate into my parenthood.
Yeah, my dad was a great provider of home, clothing, material things. My dad was also a good encourager. Always said, you can do whatever you set your mind to, and taught me a lot of things. But the thing that I needed the most, my dad didn't give me, and that was how to be a good spiritual leader in your home.
Yeah.
And that's what I needed more than anything.
Yeah.
So I was looking for people to help me with that. And so my friend Mike showed me that. I had an aunt and uncle who were a lot like my mom and dad. My Uncle Don showed me how to be a good husband. He showed me how to, love my wife. I watched how he loved my Aunt Millie. I watched how they conducted their marriage. I watched how life was at their home. And to me, the most peaceful place on earth for me, other than being in church, was at their home. Then another spiritual leader for me would certainly be my pastor that I work for in Texas, Dr. Clonch. He showed me, put it this way, if I was going to work for him, and if I was ever going to preach in his pulpit, I was going to have to make sure that everything I did went to another level.
Yeah. He set a standard.
He set a standard.
Yeah.
Yeah. He set a standard in his biblical preaching, his study, and if you were going to be in his pulpit, he didn't expect you to preach like him.
Sure. Yeah.
He didn't expect, he had multiple degrees. He didn't expect me to have, but what he did expect for me to do, or any other staff member, was you better have prepared well, and you better have a sermon that people can follow. It needs to have a theme. It needs to have a good flow to it, and it needs to be when people hear it, they go, oh, "That guy studied."
Yeah. Yeah.
He also believed in me. He always supported me. He would say, "Well, okay, let's think about it from this angle." He would do that. He would challenge me, and there were a lot of times he challenged me like, "Okay, well, I really did not think that through."
Right.
But what he never did to me was he never said, "Well, that's not a very bright idea," or "There's no way you can do it." He always said, "Okay, all right.
Yeah.
If you feel good about it, you feel that you can do this, then I'm going to support you."
Sure.
And so he inspired my faith. He empowered me not only with his words, but he empowered me with power, with authority.
Yeah. Yeah.
And he also empowered me with the resources. So those are some, and he's still a mentor in my life today.
Yeah. Of course.
He showed me how to pastor. I worked for him for 17 years.
Yeah.
I saw how he worked with people. I saw how he how he handled problems. One of my funny things about him handling a problem, when he would be upset, he had an old IBM Select typewriter in his office, and he was a really fast.
I don't know what that is, but I'm guessing it's
look it up.
really
It's
nice.
out there. And when you type one of those, it sounds like a machine gun.
Oh yeah.
And so what he would do when he was frustrated is to get his frustration out, he would type a letter.
Oh, interesting.
And so I could always hear it. I always knew that he was probably frustrated whenever I heard him in there, like, an M16 machine. So one day I walked into his office, and he called me. He said, "Hey, could you come down to my office for a minute?" I did. And he's typing, and I walk in his office. He goes, "Read this." And so I read this letter, and it was to an individual, and he was expressing his frustration, and I was like, "That is a good letter."
You want me to post it for you? What's the address?
And I gave it back to him. He goes, threw it in the trash can. He goes, "I feel better now."
Wow. That's like some therapeutic wizardry right there. Yes. Give it up for Dr. Galen Clonch,
That's right,
everybody.
Yeah.
That's genius. Okay, so to synthesize a few of the things that I'm hearing, it sounds like the spiritual leaders in your life, one, they made an investment of time in your life. Obviously, that pastor, it's an hour every Sunday. Obviously, Mike, you guys were just in proximity, it sounds like, enough for you to at least observe his habits with his kids. Like you just saw.
We lived in the same town.
You were together.
We hung out. We did things together, our families.
And Dr. Clonch invests 17 years. Well, you really invest 17 years in each other's life and ministry, but there's a lot of time there. Second, it sounds like there's habits and disciplines that are getting transferred one to the other, right? I know you as a pastor always take time for other people, even when you don't have much time to give, right? I see that behind the scenes. Maybe a lot of people don't see that behind the scenes, but I do. You know, I've been there in weeks when we had a full calendar and someone schedules a funeral and you said, okay, you know, push that. The people's more important than this or than that and that. You know, the things like habits and disciplines in your home, habits and disciplines in your ministry. I don't know if you have an IBM Select, but I do know that you have some golf balls with staff member's name on them that maybe is a similar therapeutic process, you know. But there's time.
Actually, all those golf balls that had staff members' picture, I've already hit those out in the cornfield.
I was going to say they're gone.
I need some new photos now.
Yes, and twice as many of Scott than anyone else. I don't know. I was looking for a sound effect there and I didn't get it. Now you can't do it now. You can't do it now or else it looks like I asked for it. It's like when your wife says, I was expecting an apology, but you then can no longer apologize because then you're only
too
apologizing
late.
because
Sorry.
you asked for an apology.
Well, you're talking about the
Boy, that was personal. Moving on.
Disciplines. One of the things I did, but I'll go back to my friend Mike. One of the things that made a huge impression on me was I would often watch him as a dad lay his hands on his kids and pray for them.
Yeah.
And so that spoke volumes to me because I never had my dad to do that. Certainly my pastor that was of my home church, it was a spiritual leader in my life, a mentor. He would lay his hands on me and pray for me. People in my church did, but my own dad didn't do that. So I determined that when I had kids that every opportunity that I had, that I was going to, like before they went to school, before they went to bed. I still do it today when I talk with them on the phone. Before I hang up with them, I pray for them. But I wanted to make sure that I laid my hands on them or I prayed a prayer over them every day that I could in their life.
Yeah.
And I got that from my friend Mike. He didn't say, this is what you need to do. I just watched him. And I said, that's good.
Yeah.
That's
You kind of got it by osmosis rather than by directive. I think that's incredible. And look at like the generational impact that's going to make. You know what I mean? That this guy being a spiritual leader, spending the time, being in close enough proximity that you can observe and kind of gather up some of these habits. I mean, that's changed, at the very least, Laura and Tyler's life. But I would assume Laura and Tyler, Tori and Tyler's life, probably Laura and Tyler's life as well. Yeah, thank you very much. Probably, and then I'm guessing in their marriages, and when it comes time for those guys to have kids, that's probably going to change the way that they behave with their children. You know what I mean?
well, one thing that's
huge thing.
You kind of see when things like, oh, they did get that was whenever our family would, even on our family, if it was on a Saturday, and we lived in Dallas, one of our family things we would do on a Saturday is we'd load our kids up and we'd go to Arlington, Texas, to the Parks Mall.
Sure.
And just shop around, have fun. But I always prayed before we left. Got in the car to go. So I always do that on vacation, do that still now. And one day we were somewhere, and this was after Tyler had gotten married, I think. And so we were getting ready to go, and he was driving. He goes, well, let's pray that the Lord gives us a safe trip. So he prayed nearly, like some of the same words that I prayed. So, I thought, okay, then they're getting it, That's paid off.
And to me, like, this is the essence of spiritual leadership, and I'm not going to say it's totally distinct from what the church does. Because obviously, as a pastor, I love church. I love what the church does. I believe in worship services, and I believe in the discipleship programs of a church. But very often in church, we show up and we open the Word together, we worship together, we take communion together, we pray together. Whatever the activities are that we're doing together inside of a worship service, they're all good and they build us up spiritually. But what I'm hearing, especially about spiritual leadership, is that it happens in the little moments. It happens 24/7. It happens Monday through Saturday just as much as it happens on a Sunday. And so I really I want to unpack this idea of spiritual leadership a little bit. And I don't know how long. Oh, we got more time. We got nothing but time. I'm sitting here looking like, I got to rush through it, but no, we don't. So In my mind, I started asking the question a few months ago because we're looking at planting these churches, and there are not a ton of people that are just knocking down your door to come plant a church
In Northwest Iowa.
in
rural
Northwest Iowa,
community.
rural community
Yep.
of like, say, between 5 and 10,000 people. This is not a place that a lot of people are clamoring to go. Frankly, and this is not a dig on any other denomination, but most of the churches that exist there are mainline church denominations that assign people to go places rather than sense some
Right.
kind of call. Whether it's the priest of the Catholic parish or the Lutheran folks or the Methodists. Very very often those places, their state or their conference or whoever
Sends them there.
they will send them there and say, hey, you're going to Sioux Center or Rock Valley,
And
they
that's
say,
not
thank you very much.
That's not a bad thing.
No, it's not a bad thing.
It's just their model of
Yeah,
the way they do
but
church.
it's given those denominations success in places that are not super popular.
True, yeah.
You know what I mean? And I think there's positives and negatives to all sorts of denominational affiliations, but I love what the Assemblies of God are doing in focusing on church planting, and I love that our home church is obviously in the trenches of church planting as well. But because we recognize that there's kind of this, let's say, a shortage of people graduating from college dying to go to small towns that aren't a pathway to superstardom. You know what I mean? There's no chance you're gonna just accidentally become Justin Bieber's pastor by showing up to Missouri Valley, Iowa, right? So I think you and I started thinking about this idea of, if we want to raise up pastors and if we want to raise up people that can go accomplish the work that we believe God's calling us to, we have to look from within.
Yeah.
And we've got to find a way to call out the spiritual gifts and the spiritual leadership of people in the pew. And we're not trying to make everyone a church planter. We're not trying to make everyone a pastor. But it seems like a necessary first step is to shift our thinking towards spiritual leadership. The kind of spiritual leadership and the kind of spiritual leaders that are happening 24/7, Monday through Saturday, that have unique habits, that have spent a lot of time face-to-face being mentored and mentoring others, the kind of people that are willing to do things different than the world and to live Monday through Saturday in a way that's totally unique. And, I think when it comes to anything, be it the church, be it, humans, be it Christianity, we're either reproducing or we're going to be obsolete and we're going to start dying.
Yeah.
And so if this church is going to be a life-giving, multiplicative, church-planting church, like we kind of started to realize we have got to call people.
Yeah, for a
to a
lot of
next
reasons.
level.
One, because then the people that go and plant those churches, then we know first they know we're not expecting them to go and be clones of us.
Right.
We didn't expect you to go be a clone of us. We
Right.
wanted Beacon Church to be its own church. Certainly take the things that you have learned here, the culture, the passion for missions,
Right.
the passion for outreach, being community involved. Those things we do want those things to be in those churches, but we don't want those people to be clones of us.
Yeah.
But we do want them to take what we have been doing here and go and replicate that in their own area.
Yeah. In a demographically appropriate expression.
Yeah.
I learned this in the first couple of years where I was like, well, I'm just going to start doing exactly what we do then it was Morningside. I'm going to start doing exactly what we do at my home church up here in Elk Point. And there are a few things where it was like, this works, makes a lot of sense. And there are a few things we did where it was like, didn't work quite as well. And I wonder why. Well, like the people that I'm ministering to in Elk Point are not the same as the people that you're ministering to in Sioux City.
And they're only 30 miles away, but it's still different.
It is culturally distinct. So to have a culturally appropriate expression, I mean, if Paul teaches us anything through his writings and through his missionary journeys, is that every time he approached a group of people, he did it in a way that was, demographically appropriate. Yep. And Mars Hill, he speaks one way, and in Jerusalem, he speaks another way.
But, part of our model is that we want the person to move into the community, get known in the community.
Yep.
And that's what you did. That's why in my opinion, that's why you've been successful. You moved up there.
Right.
You spent an entire year living in that community. You got involved in the school system, which in a small community, the school system is where you need to be involved. That's where everything's happening.
It's the hub. It's the
Yeah.
central hub of the entire
You
community.
started making yourself available. You volunteered. You did
Mm-hmm.
what, not student teaching, but you did
Substitute
teaching. You know, you went
Coaching
to
soccer leagues.
yeah, you went to
Yep.
city council meetings. You went
Mm-hmm.
to all those, and you began to get known.
Right.
And then, after a year, then you started having a Bible study. But then after you gotten known in the community, make contacts,
Mm-hmm.
then we launched the church.
Yeah. So I was at the South Dakota Ministers Retreat a few weeks ago, and I was talking to a guy named Dwight Santos, who, Sandos.
We'll just call him Dwight.
Dwight. I'm sorry, I'm butchering your name, but he's from Trinity Bible College, and they have a heavy emphasis on rural ministry and especially rural church planting. And he was talking to me about this idea of simplex versus multiplex relationships.
Okay.
In a large city, most people have what are called simplex relationships, which means I know this one person from this one place. In Dallas,
I see where you're going with that.
yeah, in Dallas, Pastor Johnny, I know him as the pastor of, was it Crossroads of Life Assembly of God, right? I know him, he's the pastor of Crossroads. Now, when you go into a rural city in multiplex relationships, and you grew up in smaller towns, so you know this, that same person, you may actually encounter them in 3 or 4 or 5 different places. And so part of moving to a rural community is not just physically residing there and bumping into people at the cash register. It's when you have multiplex relationships with people where they already know you from multiple places inside the same community, then that's just the way the community operates. And if you don't have multiplex relationships with people, then they don't have quite as much buy-in with you for one reason or another. So they knew me. There are some students at the school who know me as Mr. Miller, Pastor Ben, and Coach Ben. Right? So there's Mr. Miller, who is substitute taught in their classroom. There's Coach Ben, who has, been
a soccer coach
or helped direct a youth soccer league. And there's Pastor Ben, who has come in and do these things. And there's just, Ben, who we bump into and at this community event or that community event. So these multiplex relationships are where rural ministry really takes off. But it takes time to establish yourself inside of multiple dimensions of the same community.
It does.
But that's what real rural life is about, and that's why rural ministry takes more time. It was a great conversation. I don't know if Dwight wants to come on this podcast or not, but I'm just sitting here like that's, in my mind, the first church plant that we tried, it was somewhat of a simplex relationship.
We'll go in, put out some signs, put out some banners,
Yes.
hang up a shingle, and send out some flyers, and you come to us.
And it was like 20 or 25 volunteers from Sioux City who are doing church in a different town, and people from that town go, I know everyone in this town, and I walk in and I don't know anybody in this room.
Yeah.
And that is a huge dividing line in rural ministry where you just can't.
You know what that was? That was a $150,000 learning experience.
Yeah, exactly.
That's what that was.
Hey, I'm glad you guys did that so that I could come in and bat clean up and just,
So, we planted 2. We did have to close 1.
Yeah.
We're batting 500. If you bat 500 in the major leagues, you have a multi-million-dollar contract.
Crushing it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and if you can, hopefully with the next one we'll be at 66, 0.667.
And there's not a church that I haven't talked to that's done church planting that hasn't had some that they've had successes,
Right.
and they've had some that weren't success.
Yeah.
And and the reason is you're working with people,
Mm-hmm.
and
People are just messy.
yeah, but you're talking about the simplex. What was it? Simplex versus
Multiplex.
Yeah. So I have a friend that pastors in a town in Texas called Archer City, Texas, rural community outside of Wichita Falls, and he was an intern of mine for a number of years when I was in Texas, and he called me one day and he said, I've really come to the conclusion that God's called me to the rural community. This is where I fit the best. Mm-hmm. And so he's not only just a pastor in a rural community. I'm talking about these different settings they have. I don't remember how he got involved, but he started working with the local funeral home.
Mm-hmm.
And the funeral director said to him, "Look, hey, if you'll do this, if you'll go to mortuary school, I'll pay for it."
Wow.
So he did, got his mortuary license. He still pastors the church there in
Sure.
town.
Yeah.
So he's Pastor John to his community, but every day throughout the week, man, he's ministering to families that are walking through difficult seasons in their life. So he's doing a lot of pastoring in that community. They may not all come to his church, but he's pastoring a community.
Yes.
And that's one of the benefits that I see that the rural community forfeits. Is that the right word? Forfeit means you get ready.
Give it up.
Yeah. One of the things that it affords, that's the word I'm looking for.
Yeah, of course.
That it affords the rural pastors. He gets to pastor a community. May not all come to his church,
Yes.
but there's a really good chance that if they don't have a church and they go through a crisis, they're going to there's a good chance they may call you to either do a family funeral or to go to the hospital and visit someone.
Yeah.
Or, it could be like that. You've heard me say this before. I would, and I don't want people to listen to this and think that he doesn't want to do weddings, but I'd rather do 10 funerals than to do one wedding. And you say, why? Well, they're certainly completely opposites in emotion. But when it comes to a wedding, really we're filling a service. We're helping a couple get married. We're celebrating. It's a wonderful thing. But when I do a funeral, I'm helping people who are walking through a really, really deep valley. And I have the opportunity to talk about the Lord. I have the opportunity to talk about eternity and the importance of making sure your life is right with God.
Yep.
And because we're all going to face death unless the rapture takes place.
So you could say in a wedding, you're just kind of doing a spiritual ceremony.
Yes.
But I think in a funeral, you're really doing spiritual leadership.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? You are face to face with people in one of the most vulnerable moments in a person's life where they are truly contemplating, the whole thing. They're contemplating eternity. They're contemplating their mortality. They're contemplating the loss. They're contemplating, all of these difficult relationships surrounding it. And you get to step in their most difficult moment and say,
and give them
I'm
hope,
here for you.
encouragement, and then raw truth.
Yeah, and sometimes takes a while to settle in.
Yeah,
but it can be a seed planted in those moments that yields fruit later on.
As Paul says, some sow, some water, some reap. We're all a part of the process.
Yeah, and sometimes we all have to do each part of the process. So when it comes to a church planting pipeline, we kind of looked inward and figured out that we're going to have to raise people up into spiritual leadership with the hope that maybe some people eventually down the road might end up going to plant churches. And, we have, spoiler alert.
Just filling the call to ministry. Might not be to plant a church, but we're hoping they'll fill the call to go plant a church.
I don't want to go too far down rabbit hole, but I will. I feel like the job of the church isn't done until you are sending people out. You know what I mean? That's the goal, is to raise them up, to send them out.
Reach them, teach them,
and a lot of
send
people, exactly. A lot of people in the church want to reach them, want to teach them, and then want them to keep volunteering at their location until they die, if we're really super honest. So I think a part of what this is a goal toward fully formed disciples who are ready to go. And yes, they may go in pastoral ministry, and yes, they may go plant churches, but they may just go to their office that they work at every day. They may just go to their home and lead their children. They may, wherever they're going, we need to, I think, raise up spiritual leaders who can take the message of Jesus beyond just knowing what it is or being a part of what a church does on a Sunday. They can actually take that out into their world. And I think spiritual leadership and training people in spiritual leadership, giving them a biblical understanding, giving them some practical habits, and then giving them a chance to go out and try it is going to be life-changing for a lot of people who might sense that they're ready for the next step. So how do you want to roll this out? Do you want me to talk about the spiritual leadership intensive we're doing, or why don't you give your version of the story? Because this probably comes down to another story where I walked into your office and was like, "Hey, you have 5 minutes to chat," and then I talked at your face for 2 hours about it. But what do you think about this spiritual leadership intensive we're about to do?
The short answer is I think it's the right thing for us to do, because you already hit on it, that we don't have a lot of people that are just, clamoring to move to Northwest Iowa to go plant churches in rural communities. It's just not happening. So we've got to, if we're going to accept this mandate and do what the Lord told us to do, to go plant 5 churches in 5 strategic cities in Northwest Iowa that do not have a Pentecostal charismatic church, then we, number one, have to do that. Number two, we've got to find people to do that. And so the best way for us to find people is to raise them up right out of our own congregation, instead of spending time traveling around the country or calling this school or that school, meeting with people that, and really too, and we need people from Iowa to go plant Iowa churches because of Iowa has a culture just like South Dakota has a culture. And so the long story, or the short answer to that is yes, we need to do this. You've been kind of the person that's done more that I've thought about it, but you started putting it on paper and with your creative brain. And so I appreciate that very much. And so, so we realize we've got to have a structure.
Yeah. And right now, what we've just kind of settled on is I'll give a big picture overview, and then I want to talk some about the specifics and why we're choosing to structure it the way we are. But the long-term structure is to identify people with ministry giftings. Second, to equip them for ministry, especially rural ministry. And then third, to send them out to plant. So to identify, to equip, and to send. So if we're going to identify people, we've just got to get our people mobile and doing ministry. And I think in that process, we're going to see people who have those giftings. Now, if they come through this intensive and we notice that they have a lot of, ministry potential, they have a heart for it, and they have character, competency, and calling, then we might move them to the equipping phase, which we'll talk about in some other podcasts some other time. But this spiritual leadership intensive, the whole, our heart from our end is to find spiritual leaders who might be called to ministry and sort of get them down this road. But on the person's end who's listening to this podcast, I guess what I want them to hear is we believe that every person who has the Holy Spirit inside of them is capable of spiritual leadership and can be called by God and gifted by God to go out and reach people. So what we're going to do, where's the camera? Is this when I'm looking down the gut? All right, I'm going to look down the gut. Here's the deal. Starting in January of 2025, we're going to have a 7-week experience called the Spiritual Leadership Intensive, where Johnny and I are going to be face-to-face with a very small number of people who we believe and who believe along with us that they are going to take a step forward in their spiritual leadership. We are going to meet once a week to rally together to look at biblical truth and to have a small group discussion time and to do some planning for things we'll talk about in a second. And then across this 7 weeks, there's also a thing that I'm going to be calling the Leadership Library, where we're going to have daily readings. There's going to be daily scripture readings and daily leadership book readings as well, and daily check-ins with a small group of people inside of your spiritual leadership squad, all right? So we're going to break down, there'll be 3 or 4 people that you'll be communicating with daily about this journey, asking high-quality questions, doing, real-world analysis of how this thing works every single day. And then at the end of this 7-week journey, after we've thought about spiritual leadership from a biblical perspective, after we've kind of developed these daily habits of reading and learning and growing and talking and iron sharpening iron, we are going to have a service project that across the 7 weeks is entirely planned and executed by the people who are in this group. So starting week 1, meeting 1, we'll have a Bible time, and we will start breaking into small groups and planning an outreach from very beginning to the execution in one of these 5 remaining target cities for our church plant. So let's say there were 12 of us. Well, we might break down into 3 groups of 4, and those 3 groups of 4 are each going to be responsible for a different element of this outreach. And starting, in probably that second week of January, and then 7 weeks later, we're going to be rolling up to Rock Valley or Missouri Valley or somewhere with a plan, with a budget, with all the kind of these things to go into that city and to make a difference for Jesus. And we may not plant a church in that city for, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, I don't know. But we are going to get people activated into the vision of like spiritual leadership in their own lives, in their own homes, in their workplace, and in a community that needs a healthy representation of the gospel. So this is the spiritual leadership intensive that we're going to put together, that we want to get started. And I'll say it now and at the end. If you want to join the spiritual leadership intensive, text the word lead. If you're bad at spelling, that's L-E-A-D. Instead of, because if they do L-E-E-D, then I'm going to end up like, buddy, I got to put you in the pipeline. No, text the word lead to 605-525-6633. That's our Beacon text line, 605-525-6633. I'm sure the tech wizards have put that up on the screen while we're doing this, right? And we'll probably put it in at the end, and there'll probably be a link below, and there'll be all sorts of things we can do. But we want people to apply to be a part of this experience. By the time this podcast is out, the application process should be open, and by about the middle of December, we should have kind of our little spiritual leadership intensive crew ready to meet. It's going to take some time prepping, getting all the materials ready for everyone. But in this spiritual leadership intensive, you're going to have face-to-face, one-on-one mentorship time with myself and with Johnny. And we are going to do our very best to give you a picture of what spiritual leadership looks like. And it might be in the context of church ministry, but it might also be in the context of just your everyday life. That, things like reading, growing, things like talking to other spiritual leaders. I mean, we could probably go on for a long time about peers that we have of ours who we respect as spiritual leaders, but you can't do it in isolation. I've never seen a good spiritual leader that does it alone, right? They've always got a group that they're running with. So all of these little elements are all coming together in this one experience. And I really hope that the people of Restoration Church, the people of Beacon Church, and even beyond, if you live in the area but you don't attend here and are really interested in spiritual leadership, hop on board, because we want to make a significant investment in people.
Absolutely.
Who we believe are going to make a significant investment in the kingdom of God.
Yeah, because there could be somebody that comes to a part of this that maybe they go to another church and they come to this and God really fires them up and they go back to their church and maybe they start a ministry there, or maybe they go to their pastor and go, you know what, I know that you've talked about church planting before. I really feel like God wants us to plant a church, and maybe God's dropped a city in their heart.
Yep.
So, but it's and again, I think you said it earlier. Some people may go through this and they may not feel the call to like, I want to go plant a church.
Right.
But it's certainly you get involved in doing ministry that helps people. It lights a fire inside of you.
Absolutely.
And you want to keep doing it. So they might come back and go, you know what? I want to do something in Sioux City. I want to start a sidewalk Sunday school outreach, or I want to start going and volunteering at the Gospel Mission, or I want to go help at the warming shelter or the soup kitchen, or I want to God speak to me and show me something I can do in my city. If we accomplish nothing but that, that's great.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's been a success.
I do think there's, I don't think there's any downside to calling out the ministry gifts that people have and giving them a chance to put them to work. Because, the worst case scenario is that they go somewhere else and start investing in other people. And that's the entire, that's the mission of Jesus, the mission of the church. Like Jesus didn't go do all the ministry himself. He had his 12. And even inside of his 12, he kind of had his 3. And from that 3 and that 12, there was the 120, and then there were the tens of thousands. And we are the
There was a 72, and then there was the 120, and then it just kept multiplying.
Yeah. And so similarly, I think we're hoping that by bringing in, a 3 or a 12.
So it was the 3, the 12, then the 72, then the 120. It just kept expanding.
Yep. And, not all of them stayed all the way through. Even some of the 3 kind of bugged out for a while there. But I think the beautiful picture and this same idea of Jesus having 12 who, lead 120 and then who help with the masses, that same idea is carried through in Paul's missionary journeys. Yeah. Paul never did anything alone. He always has a crew with him, and then Paul has Timothy, who he's going, he has a spiritual son, a mentor, of a mentee of his, who then is leading somewhere else.
Yeah.
And Paul also had a Barnabas, who was a buddy, who was along with him for the ride. So he always had a
He had
group.
Silas with him, and
Silas, Luke was probably with him for a while there. I know there was some of those relationships didn't always end up the best, whether you got John Mark or Demas or whoever it was. But even Paul modeled this same idea where anytime he was doing something significant for the kingdom, he had people along with him that
doing
he
the
was
journey.
mentoring.
He was mentoring and placing in places of leadership. So we're going to do the 7 a week. At the end of that, there'll be some kind of outreach where we're going to ask them to plan. We will help in resourcing.
Yep.
And then we're going to ask them at the end of the 7 weeks to execute the outreach. And then beyond that,
Yep.
the next step is
Well, the next step is go change the world, right? But now this,
in our program.
yeah, in our program. So, well, a couple of things. Number one, it's not a one and done thing. So the hope is to do this either like once or twice a year,
Right.
And bringing a new crew through. So if you can't,
But if a
make this
person
change
comes
everywhere-
to if a person comes to it, you use the number 12.
Yep.
So at the end of the 7 weeks after it's over with, let's say of the 12, we got 2 that said, I really feel like that maybe God is calling me to maybe go into the ministry. I don't know what that is right yet. Or they might say, man, I'm really feeling like God might want me to go, a couple, go plant a church in one of these cities. What's the next step after that?
Yep. So the next step would be probably the most painful part of the process, which would be an internship at Beacon Church, right? Come with me. I would more than willing to bring 1 or 2 people who feel like maybe rural ministry and maybe a church plant is something that they want to do. Come on in. And, everything that I do at Beacon Church, you're going to be a part of. We'll help you get credentials through Global University if you don't have them yet. I will show you how everything works. Like, I'll peel back the curtain on how my rural ministry works, and you will walk with me for a year or 18 months or so. And I think there will be people who have an idea of what rural ministry is, and then if they were to follow me, just do weekends with me, show up to the church when I show up to the church, and kind of walk through the whole day with us, they will see what it all entails and go, that's not for me.
Yeah.
And they'll go, okay, cool, somewhere else, which I'm totally down for. But there may be someone who goes, like, this feels like the right fit. And now, obviously, they're going to do things differently than I do them. That's totally fine. But just showing them behind the curtain of, here's what it takes to just make a Sunday service happen when you are the person in rural ministry.
Yeah.
Get them in the pulpit, get them going to community visits, get them, doing all these various things. And after about, a year and a half of really, once they feel like they have their feet underneath them and that they're capable of understanding and executing these kinds of rural ministry things, then we just begin the process of sending them, right? So identify people through a spiritual leadership intensive, equip people through a rural ministry internship, and then we'll walk through a process of sending. My sending process, the Beacon Church sending process, which has been on other parts of this podcast, so we don't have to rehash that whole thing, but
the main things of that is if we get down to that point and we feel like, okay, we've got somebody that is identified, they have a burden to go. We'll say Rock Valley. I really feel like that's where God wants us to go. Then our process would be that we're going to ask them to move there to that community. We will help to do everything we can to financially resource them. In other words, make sure that they get paid.
Yep.
But we're going to ask them to live in that community for a minimum of a year.
Yeah.
Start getting known, and either volunteering in a school as a sub, finding some ways in the community, start connecting, networking.
Developing multiplex relationships.
Yes. Then start having a Bible study in your home. And then after a year, or it could be 2 years. Sometimes the rural community, as it can be a hard nut to crack to get into.
Yeah.
And then after a period of time, then we will officially launch the church. We will help resource that church as much as we can through finances, through our staff availability.
Yeah.
Through helping them process of credentialing, we're helping them with bylaws and constitution, and they'll be a part of board meetings, so They'll see how a board meeting works. They'll have accountability structure.
Yeah.
And then, the ultimate goal is to get it planted, like we've done with you, get it going, support it, get it healthy, and then set it in order and let it stand on its own 2 feet.
Yeah. Be an autonomous church affiliated with the Assemblies of God.
Yeah. And our, that's our time frame on that is 2 to 5 years somewhere
After
in there.
launch.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think just speaking as someone who's been on the receiving end of this planting process, of the sending process, the two great things about not being a lone wolf are resource and relationship. Those are the two things that I have felt I've had in abundance through Morningside when we were initially planted, now Restoration Church, is that there is a tremendous value in knowing that you're not doing it alone.
Yeah.
That you have not just a safety net, but like you have a team of people praying together, working together, you have resources to pull from, but also the relationships through the process are just as valuable as the resources on the front end of the process. Yeah. I mean, you have to have the resources on the front end of the process just to get it off the ground. But if you as a minister are going to continue to have any longevity and any effectiveness, you have to be embedded in relationships. Like you have to know that you're not alone. I think loneliness
it's a terrible thing.
Probably kills more ministries than anything.
And messes up a lot of marriages.
Oh, man. Messes up marriages, messes up ministries, messes up people. Like we weren't designed to do anything alone, right? God saw that man was alone, said that's not good.
That's
it's
right.
not good that man's alone. So whether it's in the, in the context of you as a person or you as a church planter or a pastor, doing it alone or trying to like forge relationships, because relationships take time to develop. I mean, one nice thing about this church planting pipeline is likely it's going to be a years-long process, and you're going to have
it actually takes longer than what we thought.
It always takes longer.
When 2015, when the Lord laid this on my heart, I thought, well, within the next year or so, we'll have a church. Well, the first one happened in 19, and then yours didn't happen until 21.
22 we finally launched, but yeah, same idea.
And so here we are now at 20, coming up on 25, and we want to do 5 more of these over the next 10 years. So to do that, we've got to get this structure moving now. We've got to get we got to get people in the pipeline so that, in theory, maybe one every 2 years or 2.5 years,
And I guess another part that I would want to say is we're not even just looking to send one pastor alone. I think it'd be good for us to send teams of people.
Yeah.
That's one thing that I had on launch day where we had just a handful of families who are dedicated to showing up and helping out, even if it was short term. I had a couple of families that said, hey, for the first year, we're going to be at Beacon every Sunday. We're going to help out however we can.
Yeah.
And for the first year, they came up to Elk Point with me. They were at events. They helped with things. They were giving. They were serving. They were, a part of it. And they said, hey, once that year was up, they were like, we love you guys. We're so excited. But by the time we'd gotten a year in, we had experienced a little bit of growth. And so when they left, obviously our hearts were hurting, but they came back here. So, one of them moved to the other side of Nebraska, but which we love you guys. If the Rosners listen to this, we love you guys. But
other side of Nebraska, I think they moved like southern Nebraska, really close to Kansas.
Yeah, it's basically Kansas, but all the way across the
we missed them here, and you missed them there.
We missed them very, very much. But and then there were some other people who attended Beacon for a while, and then after about a year, like, hey, love you guys, so glad we could be a part of it. Now it's time for us to return back to Restoration Church. So even if there are some people who are interested in that, want to become, learn about spiritual leadership, and they know that they want to be a part of the plant process, but maybe they don't want to be the person planting.
True.
There's a way that we can forge these people together that can be way more effective, to pray together, to meet together. I think there's a reason that Jesus sent them out 2 by 2, know?
And something else you said, I'm not against the mega church at all. But I really don't think that's what God's heart is for there just to be mega churches.
Yeah.
The church is to be about planting churches. Churches plant churches.
Absolutely.
And you can go into a small community and of 2,500, and if you're running 200, 250, 300 people, you're a mega church.
Absolutely.
And by percentage, you probably have more percentage than a mega church does.
Yeah, 90% of churches in America are 100 people or less.
Yeah, and in Iowa, I think the rule is, at least in the Assemblies of God, that if 50% of our 116 plus churches are could be 50 or less.
Yeah. And a lot of a large percentage of Americans choose to attend churches that have smaller attendance. There are a lot of
family connect, because of connection, because of relationships.
Yeah, which that community and it's a crusty word now, but that fellowship that is supposed to happen, I think it happens in a unique way in those smaller settings.
And I do think that though that those churches should grow. What does that look like?
Yeah.
Doesn't mean that they have to be running 500, 600. They just need to be growing.
Yep.
And growth happens and happens incrementally,
Yes.
It's like you don't go from being born to running the next day,
And also, I think a lot of the church plants that I know of become church planters or church multipliers. So even though they're only a 5 or 10-year-old church, they're planting a church.
Yeah.
Even though they only have 50 to 100 people, they're still sending people out. Because, if the Lord is behind it and if you're willing to step through a process, he'll make the provision happen no matter what size you are.
I don't remember what the guy's name is, but there's a church up in Minnesota. I think it's Cold something, Minnesota. I can't remember the name of that town. But
Cold Stone Creamery.
yeah, no, it's not Cold. It's Cold something, Minnesota. AG Church there. If I remember correctly, he spoke at a district council my first year here, and their model, I don't know if it's still this way, but I don't think I'm missing. But every time their church reached 500, averaging 5, they planted a church.
That makes a lot of sense. And intentionally sent some people out.
Is there a cold something? Anyhow,
don't know my Minnesota geography.
But they planted numerous churches, and their model is that anytime the mother church reaches 500, they plant a new church.
And I think that's super healthy. I think very often we have unintentional division. We have unintentional church plants that are really just church splits in disguise.
Yeah.
But it's not often that we have leaders who are like, well, hey, once we get to a certain point, we are going to send people out.
Yeah.
And I think, oh my goodness, I don't know how I want to say this best, but if you look at the statistics, so many churches are closing their doors every single year.
Yeah.
And churches that have been around 50, 100, 150 years, even some that haven't been around very long at all. But one of the reasons that the Assemblies of God is even staying, even or slightly growing year over year, is through the planting of the church. I believe the church needs a reset, needs a refresh in our world right now.
And there's certainly AG churches that close every year, but we have to stay above more opening than more closing.
Yeah, and I think that's the only way that the church is going to stay relevant. And it's kind of not a metamorphosis, but there's I don't know how to say it, but there's a focus that comes. That a church that isn't focused on sending is going to be more healthy and more vibrant. Yeah,
because they're outward focused, not inward focused.
Ooh, that sounds like another podcast. That sounds like we're going to show up for one real soon.
We better wrap this one up. We've been at an hour and a half nearly.
Oh, my land. So yeah, I got to go.
So what's the text that people need if they're interested in this? What do they?
Text the word LEAD to 605-525-6633.
And our goal is that we want this to begin in January of 2025. So which camera am I supposed to be looking at? So if you're interested, then go to that website or that text the word LEAD to that number, fill out that application so we can get you in the process so that we are ready to go in January of 2025.
I'm ready for it.
Yeah, me too.
You ready for it?
I'm ready.
We'll see you there.
I'm ready for lunch.
I'm ready for lunch. Let's go.
Thanks for listening, and be sure to follow Restoration Podcast on Spotify and Apple. If you're watching on YouTube, please like, comment, and subscribe.